This is the Person of Interest podcast, where we meet extraordinary people with a story to tell.
Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you back to the Stockholm School of Economics here in Riga on a very spring-like day, even though it's still the middle of February at the time of recording. I've also got another tremendous guest who I'm very much looking forward to speaking with. His name is Andris K. Berzins. Now, the K, sometimes when people insist on pronouncing the K in their names, it can sound a little bit pompous. But in this case, I think it's fully justified because anyone who lives in Latvia for any period of time knows there are an awful lot of Andris Berzins around, and quite a lot of them are well known. Right. I think you're probably the best known these days, having superseded the previous Andris Berzins. So welcome to SSE Riga.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Andris is managing partner at Change Ventures, which means, to cut a long story short, he's an investor. He's one of the more, let's say, adventurous and successful investors in the Baltic at the moment. And he's going to be telling us a little bit about his experiences as an investor, investing particularly in startups, young companies. But first, Andris, can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from and how you ended up to be sitting here today?
Thanks. Sure. It's a kind of a long story. I'll try and keep it relatively brief. I have a British accent, as you can hear, and that's because I spent most of my school years growing up in the UK, but I was actually born in Australia. So my parents are Latvian. After the Second World War, as refugees and some years in camps in Germany, they ended up in Australia.
I noticed when you say Australia, you have got an Australian accent.
It comes out occasionally, yes. And so I finished high school and university undergraduate in the UK, and then moved here in '93 when things were still wild and crazy, you could say. Worked here for 3 years, then did my MBA at Stanford. Spent 2 years in California, 2 years working in consulting in Boston, and then joined a tech startup in Philadelphia. My wife was doing her next degree, and spent more or less a dozen years in tech startups. That one in Philadelphia, we moved back to Latvia while I was working there. I ran marketing, business development, sales, various roles on the business side. And then later worked in a UK startup, a bunch of companies in the Baltic States. So have been involved actually for the longest time, not as an investor, but as either a founder or an executive in various startups around the world, and it was really about four plus years ago when I got together with my partners and we set up Change Ventures. So actually, how good I am as an investor we'll still find out. It's a very long-term investing game in the venture capital world, but we've raised now it's the first pan-Baltic pre-seed and seed funds. So we invest in, we back ambitious Baltic founders from Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And we invest very early stage and look for those who want to build world-class companies, something really, really big.
There's something interesting you said there, which I was going to maybe work up to later, but I think we can tackle it now. You said it's a long-term investing game. Now, yes. This to me runs a little bit counter to some of the messages that we get when we're talking about startups and tech companies, in that it seems much more of a short-term game. People are talking short-term, i.e. we set up this company, we make as many millions as we can very quickly, and then we sell out to a much bigger company. This is our exit. Everyone talks about exit. They don't even talk about selling the company. This is the exit, as if they're waiting in a waiting room, and that the business is just sort of taking part in this waiting room, and then we exit, and that's it. But you're saying it's long-term. So how do we reconcile these two things?
The average holding period for an investment for a venture capital fund is somewhere in the period of 8 years. So while it may seem short, actually the real story is that it's relatively short given the size of the successful businesses that are created, right? So businesses that are, the reason venture capital exists is essentially you could think of it as pre-funding sales, marketing, and growth costs very early in the business to enable it to grow much faster. And so what we see is that these businesses, the successful ones are ones that are able to capture large markets and essentially replicate their product or service rapidly, thereby growing quickly. And the whole story around exits is that the investors that back these kind of companies like us, we generally have funds which have a fixed term. So our fund today, the one we recently closed, it has a 10-year term, i.e. we should be selling out all our positions within 10 years. And when all your investors are like that, then generally the exit is to sell to another company. It may be an IPO, but ultimately most of the investors are selling their positions. That doesn't mean the founders are necessarily going away. So if they're acquired by a bigger company, they may then be running the division that is within a bigger company, and some of them stay there for a long time. Others actually decide that they like the early stage of building the company rather than the corporate environment better, and then they may leave after a while and go and do the next startup.
Which category would you class yourself in?
So I have worked in startups from the very earliest days, and I would say around 60 or so employees in a company, and for me it's already getting too big. So the part that I really enjoy is when a company is really small, very young, and still trying to figure out what's called product market fit. So what product are they selling to which customers, how, with what business model, and they're trying to figure out what that business is actually going to look like. And to me, that's the interesting part of a business. It's also a risky part, but it's the part where all sorts of things can move. There are many pieces of the puzzle to put together, and so it's the exciting and interesting part of the business.
I mean, do you ever find yourself advising, because you act in an advisory capacity as well as an investing capacity, kind of advising people to not exit, to hold on a bit longer and do it that way?
Well, actually, in most successful cases, those startups will have had offers to sell out earlier and will have turned them down. And one of the hardest decisions for venture capitalists and the founders that they're backing is whether to take this offer or whether to double down and go for something bigger, right? Because obviously a bird in the hand, beats two in the bush and so forth. And so that is always going to be a tough decision for founders, because there's always the risk that you keep going and something goes wrong and you end up getting less of a successful exit. But those are, in some sense, nice problems to have, I would say.
Would you make a lot of money or a heck of a lot of money?
Exactly. Exactly. The reality is that being a founder of a startup is hard. It's very hard. It's a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility, and most startups actually fail, right? So in our venture fund, we modeled that we will literally write off 40% of the investments that we do. We hope it will be less, but we're expecting that much of them will. And that might not be because the team has done anything wrong. It might be that some big company launches some product that just wipes out their market in an instant. It might be regulation changes. It might be unexpected things happen in the market. It might be something, God forbid, happens to the founders. I mean, all sorts of things happen that cause a business not to be successful. But that's the journey we're on, and we love working with great, ambitious founders who are excited to be doing what they're doing.
I'm just rewinding a little bit to what you were saying about your biography at the beginning. You're a Latvian family growing up in Australia and in England, getting education in the US, returning to Latvia kind of as quickly as you could as well, or presumably this was for the first time. Do you think this gave you a sort of international perspective, maybe at a time when it wasn't as common to have an international perspective? We like to think of particularly young people today as being very sort of integrated with the rest of the world, but back then it was still fairly unusual.
Well, Yeah, I mean, distinctly remember a conversation with someone in '96 when I got into Stanford Business School who said, "You're crazy. Like, this is, Latvia is growing like nuts. You're going to miss out on all this opportunity." And it was obvious to me, but there were quite a few people who would consider that, and yes, maybe I did miss out on some opportunities, but in the long term, I think it was a great decision. And I would definitely tell all young people that traveling abroad for some time is very healthy for your education, and getting a great education anywhere is always a good choice in my view.
And why was it Stanford in particular?
It's kind of the school that if you get in, you go. I applied not really expecting to get in, to be honest, and was very pleasantly surprised. But it's one of the world's top business schools, and so I had 365 classmates from all over the world, amazing people with great experience, and it was the kind of place where you start and you realize you have to swim really, really hard just to stay, with your head above water, and those, I learned a ton from great professors. Lots of very interesting academic subjects, which I had the luxury to spend 2 years full-time studying, and then of course the network that you have afterwards is fantastic, and many of my classmates have done very well, and they will help me with introductions when I need them, and vice versa, and so that network is really important.
I mean, were there any teachers, professors, or maybe just sort of individual lessons that you picked up there which really kind of clicked something in your brain, or maybe you're sure you wouldn't have encountered elsewhere?
So I think there were some fundamentals that were very useful. I had a fantastic business law professor that, I'm never a lawyer, but I deal with a lot of legal documents, and sort of those fundamentals of business law are very helpful. Day-to-day finance, accounting, all of those basics are useful for doing the hygiene in any business. The best class I ever had was a corporate strategy class with Garth Salona, who was later dean of the school, and very high level. Everyone's read every single case before every single class, super prepared, 90 minutes of very intense discussion about a case, and your mind kind of blows, right? It's amazing experience.
So is that one of those cases where you see someone who's kind of at the top of the game, and it makes you raise your game because you realize you have to do it as seriously as well, even just to keep up?
Absolutely, and when your classmates are really, really bright and you're fighting to keep up, then you definitely have a lot of work to do to match that.
Is that something that you look for now when you're looking at companies? These kind of... Sometimes you meet people, don't you, when you just think this person is really switched on, knows what they're doing.
Yeah, so we definitely look for extraordinary founders, right? And the thing with a startup is it's very dependent on who the founding team is, and we invest at the stage where the product they're selling, the market they're targeting, the business model they have a theory for what they will do. We know a bunch of these things will change. They may even change radically. And so what we are really trying to pick is a set of founders who have what we call grit. So passion and perseverance to really go, as I say, walk through walls and just make things happen. Be self-aware enough to understand when things are not going well and when they need to turn a corner and do things differently. Right? These are qualities which not everyone has, I would say, and we look for extraordinary founders, and that's the number one criteria for us to invest.
I mean, there's a lot of emphasis placed these days on kind of it's cultivated really, the sort of the ego of the business person. I mean, the ego of the founder. Do you sometimes have to kind of tackle this?
We definitely don't look for ego.
Yeah.
Ego is a challenge. I think you need sufficient ego to have confidence and to basically have the confidence that your ambitions could be realized. And if you don't have sufficient ego for that, then you wouldn't embark on that crazy journey in the first place. So you need that, but then at the same time, you need to temper that ego sufficiently to be self-aware of what's actually going on, react to reality, to build a team around you. So people with too much ego, we see have a real challenge building a strong team, because in a very fast-growing business, what usually happens is the founders will effectively outgrow their own role. Right. So what often happens is that they will be good at managing a very small company, and if they're successful and the company becomes much bigger very quickly, they will find that they need to hire people with much more experience, maybe who are brighter than them, more capable in many different ways. Hire them, and they will need to work for them, and they need to manage people who have, on paper, could be their bosses. Yeah. Right. And so that's something you can't do without being aware of your ego and managing that well.
So I guess you need to be bright enough to realize that there are brighter people out there.
Exactly.
And you should have them on your side.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
Well, could you talk a little bit about maybe the transition from when you finished your education and you're starting to practically apply what you've learned in the real jungle of business? Yep. Some of your first experiences, perhaps, and what struck you about when invoices are involved, not just putting papers in,
Yeah, so actually, in some sense, my first startup was actually when I finished undergrad and came here to Latvia. So I worked for 3 years at Coopers and Lybrand, which later became PwC. So Niels Malmgiles had just set up the company here, and I was one of the first employees. And it was like a startup in the consulting world, because these companies, these auditing and consulting companies existed elsewhere, but in Latvia it was completely fresh,
new, yeah.
Completely new. And so I did 2 weeks of audit work, and then told Niels that really I can't do any more audit work. I'm not built for this. And so actually I started the consulting business, mostly corporate finance consulting initially. And so literally I was this 21-year-old kid going and advising much older people with more experience on finance issues, and we were doing various projects, valuation work. We ended up doing a big privatization project for the EBRD, and that was definitely a fast learning curve. And I did undergrad business as well, so there was a number of useful things I'd learned already.
But then how did you convince people that you really knew what you were talking about? Because if you're coming off the back of after 2 weeks, you said, I can't handle this anymore, but then you're advising, as you say, these more expensive people. Is this just a sort of strength of character thing?
Maybe. It was also an environment where many of the companies we were working with were managed by people who were still in the same jobs they had been when the Soviet Union was running this. So the craziest conversation I remember is with the head of the Rezekne milking machine factory, which no longer exists, but he had been factory director for, 30 years or something. And we were talking about the privatization process, what's going to happen. After 5 minutes, it was clear he had no idea what profit and loss was. Absolutely no idea. And just sort of explaining what's going on in the future was a real challenge. And actually the vignette for me was I asked him, how has he been so successful? Because he had all of this German production equipment there. And he said, it's very simple. Once a month, I get in the train and go to Moscow with a crate of vodka and drink with my buddies in the ministry. And then you're like, oh, okay.
Different investment model.
Slightly different investment model, different management model. Like, what are we going to do here? It's, that business didn't survive, right?
It ran out of vodka.
And but some of the managers from those days were able to pick up the basic concepts of business and quickly apply them and adjust as the markets were shifting very dramatically, but many of them couldn't. But the advantage I had was I'd grown up in the West in capitalism, and I understood the basics of what was going to happen, and so in some sense I had an advantage there. Right?
And I guess you really did sound like a fresh new voice as well then, I guess.
In some sense, yeah.
And so if we fast forward, nearly 30 years since then, the landscape's changed somewhat, I would say.
A lot, yeah.
So what sort of people are you encountering now when you're going to talk about business?
So now many of the investments we have are run by fairly young founders. So they're often below 30. We have a handful of older founders. Most of them are below 30. And they're, I see them as an exciting new generation that many of them don't remember the Soviet era. They weren't around then. They are Western thinking from day one, very open, speak great English, have a fantastically ambitious mindset, and those are exciting people to work with. So that's why I do the job I do, because they're fun to work with, and they don't have the baggage that perhaps people 10, 20 years older than them, some still carry around today from the Soviet years. And so without this baggage, life is much easier. So, in some sense, I feel sorry for some of the generation that really lived through that transition, because it was very, very hard. But this young generation is amazing. I mean, they're powering away.
And it does seem to be true that there is a bit of a buzz across the whole of the Baltic, particularly startup scene, but innovation scene maybe more widely. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, is it hype or is it real?
No, it's reality, right? So it's reality that there are quite a few very, very successful startups in this region. Most of them are in Estonia today, and that's basically a legacy of Skype. So Skype had 4 Estonian programmers as their first employees, and when Skype was sold, those programmers earned a few $100 million, and also because it was a venture-funded company where you typically give employee options to sort of the next levels of managers. When you have a really big exit like Skype, it spawns a whole bunch of people who some of them have a few million, some of them have enough to buy their house. But what happened was, I've counted already 60 plus startups that have been founded by ex-Skype people, right? And so you just have this explosion of new companies, and now we're already seeing the next generation. So spin-offs from TransferWise, from Pipedrive, from Bolt, which are all companies started by ex-Skype people. And so that, in Estonia, it's very, very fast moving. In Lithuania, we're also seeing the first unicorns, very large startups that are scaling up and starting to spin off new teams. In Latvia, it's not going as fast yet, but I think that's just a matter of time.
But I think that is an important thing you identified, that with the Skype phenomenon, they exited, but then they didn't really exit because, as you say, they started other companies and went into other ventures. Well, do you think that is, it seems maybe that is the new model, because I guess profit's not the only motivation, is it?
Well, it's so I'm not sure I'd call it the new model. I think it's in the technology industry, it is a very common way for businesses to be run. There are bootstrapped, very successful businesses around there. The difference, and I think the important thing to understand why Skype had such an effect on the Estonian ecosystem, is that businesses which grow very, very fast, very big, and are venture funded and have broad option pools generate a much bigger impact on the ecosystem, right? So if you compare it to Latvia's unicorn, Meetups, very successful company building routers, $250 million business, fantastic profits. The 2 owners are very wealthy, some of the wealthiest people in Latvia. No one else owns any part of the company. The company hasn't been sold, so the wealth distribution effect is very minimal, right? They're wealthy, they pay taxes, it's great. I have nothing, hats off to them. They built an amazing business, but it never had the same impact much more broadly in the economy as, for example, Skype did.
But isn't that also because of the nature of the product, whereas Meetups is...
It's not the nature of the product. But I can tell you look at Israel, there are lots of networking startups that grow very, very big, exit, and they spawn 20 more networking startups. And here in Latvia, we don't have any spin-offs from Meetups.
No, I just mean in terms of sort of the public exposure, say, of Skype, the fact that ordinary people are involved in using the product.
So you're right, actually, that there is the other aspect of the impact of Skype is that it's a consumer brand, and that has much more of, that's been one of the drivers for Estonia being very successful in building all the e-government concepts and sort of digital society concepts, because everyone in Estonia intuitively understands that IT is good and Estonia is good at it. because of Skype, right? And so we don't have that legacy. Everyone in Latvia has a phone that is connected to a MikroTik router, but they never.
But
know
they don't know it necessarily,
right? Because it doesn't show up. And so, so I think there is a disproportionate impact by consumer brand startups, for sure. And so, the maximum impact is consumer brand, broad option pool, venture funded, large exit. But even if it wasn't a consumer brand, it would have a bigger impact.
Another project that you're deeply involved in and we're co-founder of is the TechChill, an annual, business startup. I'm loath to call it conference because that seems like a very old-fashioned word.
It is a conference.
An event. Yes. Could you tell us a little bit about that, about and the purpose of it, let's say?
So TechChill is actually a spin-off, you could say, of the TechHub Riga Foundation, which we set up 8 years ago. And TechHub Riga was the first sort of startup ecosystem community organization here, a non-profit set up by myself and 3 other entrepreneurs. And the goal was basically to give a venue and a focus for the startup community, which at the time was very nascent. TechChill actually grew out of the launch party for TechHub, which then we later decided to do every year and renamed it TechChill, and it became bigger than TechHub itself, and so we spun it off in a separate foundation. But basically, it is the biggest event every year where startup founders, investors, corporates who are interested in the innovation space come together and meet. And our main goal, actually, the sort of criteria for success is, how many meetings happen that then spawn some partnership, investment, growth, and improvement in the ecosystem. So one of the stories I heard recently was a gentleman who had arrived in Latvia actually and happened to have seen a presentation by a startup right in exactly his space that he never imagined that was possible, and a few years later I know he's actually working with that company and building a business with it, right? And so these kind of chance encounters are important, and having these events just multiplies the chance that this will happen.
And maybe as someone who's an attendee at TechChill, how would you suggest that they kind of work the event? What's the best way to go about it?
So it really depends what kind of attendee you are. If you're a startup founder looking to raise money, you want to try and meet the investors, the relevant investors for you. So not all will be relevant, and my advice is always to be very thoughtful about who you want to talk to in terms of stage of investment, industry focus, and so forth. So if you're an investor, then you obviously want to meet startups, right? And if you're the general public interested in what's happening in innovation, then there are lots of very interesting talks and panel discussions that will give you insights into what's happening.
I mean, I've been there a few times, and isn't it a very impressive and well-organized event? But it always makes me realize that I'm not cut out to be an investor, because I listen to the pitches, and every single one, more or less, I think, that's a really good idea. If I had any money, I'd probably put it into that. And then the next one comes on, and I think, that's a really good idea. If I had any money, I'd probably put it into that. And I realise I have no ability to differentiate between them whatsoever. So maybe...
it's not easy for us either.
But then it's, when it's theoretical and you're not actually putting any money in, I guess that probably focuses the mind quite considerably when you are putting your money up.
Yep.
But one of the highlights is the pitching contest. In fact, several pitching contests which are happening. The internet is replete with advice on how to pitch. Could you give us maybe your little sort of crib or your little piece of advice on what is the best way to pitch?
So the way to think about a pitch, especially a public pitch on a stage, is you're telling a story. And you need that story to have emotion, right? So the biggest mistake I see founders do is sort of pitch the concept, the technology, the rationale for why what we're doing it makes sense. Whereas actually what you want to do is you want to capture someone's imagination, you want to capture their hearts, you want to get them excited. These are all emotional things, right? So you have to find a way to wrap your product, service, concept in something that is emotional. Tell a story, right? And that's really the most important thing to think about, and that you don't have to answer all the questions. You have to you have to captivate people, because your goal in a pitch is if you're pitching to investors, your goal in a pitch is to get a meeting, right? So is to capture them, to give them enough, excite them enough to say, I want to meet that person, right? And because, especially in early stage, a lot of it is around the founder. The founder is showing themselves, and that emotion and passion for what they're doing is really important.
So this is more like the old style kind of Hollywood movie pitch, really, rather than we have got everything worked out. Yes. Here are the figures.
Yes, you could say. And the other interesting thing about pitching is that it's also a different game in different locations. So here we're in Northern Europe, where people are relatively calm and thoughtful and everything. Usually when founders are traveling to the US to pitch, I tell them they now have to change their pitch to be as aggressive and ambitious to the point where they feel really uncomfortable. When they feel really uncomfortable, the Americans will think they're kind of lukewarm.
Halfway there.
Right? Halfway there. Because Americans are, the culture is a much more aggressive and in-your-face culture. And if that's the sort of the level of emotion and sort of aggression around you, then you'll need to match that energy, basically.
Well, I think emotion is a good word to finish on. I mean, there are 1,000 more things I'd like to ask you, but maybe you can come back for a future podcast as well,
sure.
And we can tackle
Love
those.
to.
Thank you very much for joining me today, Andris K. Berzins.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was produced by SSC Riga. If you'd like to learn more about the topic, visit the open course schedule at SSC Riga Executive Education. For more podcasts, find us on Spotify, iTunes, or the platform of your choice. Remember, share this episode with your friends and colleagues.